Matt Dillahunty has tried to downplay everyone leaving the ACA in the last few months as normal attrition. This is not true. Every single person left because they were tired of fighting key people at the ACA who were more concerned about Stephen Woodford and how upset his fanbase was than how much harm has been done to quite possibly the most marginalized group of people. Putting aside right or wrong, the ACA has exactly zero responsibility in their bylaws to ensure that YouTube personalities are recognized as a vulnerable group. They do have an obligation to operate without discrimination against people based on gender. Matt, who has decided that he can speak for us all, has never asked any of us why we left. I did not leave because of the election. I left because of what the election represented. It was a part of the big picture that was painted. The people who wanted to be in power did not understand what it meant to be marginalized, nor did they care to learn about it. And they definitely didn't know what to do to reduce harm and work towards inclusivity. For them, language is a weapon to be used to win an argument. They don't understand that what they call free speech, logic, and being level-headed is actually a dog whistle for being able to inflict harm without accountability. Sensitivity and feelings carry no weight for them. These are emotional things, which have been labeled as illogical. Matt is using language against those who have left the ACA in a very calculated way. He calls anything that puts the ACA in a bad light rumors, and anything that the heretics claim to be true as conspiracy. Unfortunately, even though there have now been several people who have come forward to confirm that the mass exodus of people from the ACA was not coincidental and meaningless, they will find a way to think Matt is right. Clare Wuellener, former ACA director.
What is currently happening at the ACA is a microcosm for the atheist movement as a whole. There are those who will say that atheism is a singular stance on one issue, and not a movement. And while that's true, there's no denying that there are prominent atheists who play a large role in speaking out against religion. However, what has become painfully obvious is that there is a faction that is growing that seeks to alienate the marginalized. They say that they want to encourage growth through discourse by having difficult discussions. But what they really want to do is embolden oppressors and silence the most vulnerable. Those of us who volunteered did so because we believed in the cause of separation of church and state and providing a space for people to safely discuss the harms of religion. It is with great sadness that I state that the ACA is no longer safe for everyone. It has become infested with people who are unwilling to research, are blind to the science, are embracing and abusing their privilege, and are holding on to antiquated bigotry. Therefore, it is no longer a place in which I want my name attached. I truly hope that the ACA turns around, but the current trajectory lends me no hope that this will happen, so my hope instead is with the vulnerable. May you find a safe refuge where you can be yourself, be appreciated, feel valued, and feel heard. We are not backing down from fighting for you. We refuse to do it on their platform, on their terms, where bigotry is allowed to stand, but voices raised in support are silenced. We fight on. This isn't a matter of just feeling unwelcome. It's a matter of life and death. We are literally seeing transgender people being killed in record numbers for just being who they are. Yet the ACA is allowing guest hosts who promote transphobic ideas and allow their followers to harass transgender content creators. And the ACA allows hate speech on their social media, including questioning whether or not transgender people actually exist. If they won't stand up for the most vulnerable population among us, it's not the place for me. There comes a point where you must stand up and say enough. That moment came for many volunteers when the ACA apologized to Woodford, thereby betraying their transgender viewers and members. Janet Reyes, former social media specialist, administration.
I was voted off the ACA board because I supported the original board statement apologizing to the community for having Stephen Woodford on ACA-sponsored programs without addressing the controversy over the transphobic content in at least 3 of his videos, and before he had acted to address, correct, amend, or apologize for any of his statements. I knew I was falling on a sword at the election meeting when I, like the other candidates, was asked by the mob that had gathered there if I supported the original board statement, and if I still supported it now. I said yes, I supported the original statement, I stand by it, I consider it accurate, and I unequivocally stand with the trans community. That sealed my fate, and I would do it all again because those are the values that I've always worked to uphold in the 20 years I was involved with the atheist community of Austin. The election and how it was carried out left me stunned and reeling, and incredibly sad and disillusioned, not for the loss of an election, that's democracy, but for the loss of a community. This is not the ACA that so many of us have poured our hearts and our blood, sweat and tears into for all these years. Consequently, after seeing that the majority of local people who cared enough to show up at an election, as well as the vast majority of the online fans, valued the feelings of their privileged, misguided buddy over the rights of marginalized people, valued YouTube clicks over inclusion and equality, valued hate speech over empathy and compassion, valued internet fame over reaching out to the most vulnerable among us, and valued aggression over positive community for all, I realized that I could also no longer act as a de facto spokesperson for the organization by appearing as a volunteer host on its media productions. So, after 13 years of working as a crew member on the Atheist Experience, and 6 years and 51 episodes of being a rotating co-host, with a great deal of sorrow I resigned from the show as well. John Iacoletti, former treasurer and membership chair.
I have watched the atheist movement from the fringes for a long time. It's really important with the way that some religious groups attack the basic freedoms of others, that people are vigilant and ready to stand against these kind of assaults, on everything from reproductive rights to putting children in camps to pray the gay away, etc. But I've never felt safe in the movement, personally. The reactionary elements dominate, and they maintain that dominance with a lot of bullying, while hypocritically insisting that they just want a free exchange of ideas, as long as they are in charge of what ideas get exchanged and which are unworthy of consideration. The one group that pretty solidly stood in contrast to the general drift was the ACA. In the echo chamber of dude bro skeptics, they were the one discordant voice of humanism. They weren't perfect, but they tried. And now that is gone. The repeated missteps and betrayals of principle by this group has caused chaos, and now it is no longer the same group, and it never will be again. It's been around for 20 years, and all it took was one blue-eyed, well-spoken transphobe to bring it down. I've been watching the situation, at first with some hope. I have wanted for a while to come out as a non-binary person. I spent years thinking of myself as both a woman and a man, while having no language to explain that and no confidence to voice it. But seeing how people have treated the trans and non-binary people in their midst, seeing the abuse of the outspoken and the fickleness of supposed allies, I don't have the strength to put myself out there like that. It's just too painful now. I am ashamed of my weakness, but I can't do it. It's too delicate a part of me, too close to the core to allow me to expose it to abuse that way. I don't have any hope the ACA will change. I'm here to bury it, not to save it. But I do hope that other groups will take their place, and they will remember that marginalized people need the shelter of a strong and inclusive secular community. And one day maybe we will get one. Anonymous number 3, former service user.
When I started as a moderator at the ACA, it was out of curiosity. I had no burning desire to help the organization. I kinda liked their shows, but felt no special connection. Nor was I especially intent on being an activist for any cause. I was surprised to find a great team there, a very professional atmosphere, and rather strict, but very sensible and sensibly applied rules. I enjoyed my new hobby, and felt I was doing something good there. I was again surprised when the Stephen Woodford kerfuffle came, and the SMS stepped down. There was none of the conviction and integrity displayed which I had come to expect from members of this organization. There was no clear policy, just clueless attempts to mitigate damage and placate the enraged dude bros who didn't want to accept that attacking marginalized groups can actually have consequences. Jamie succeeded making me wait a few more days before resigning my own position as a moderator, but after the second statement, apologizing to Stephen and his interview on Non Sequitur, I had nothing but disgust and pity left for the ACA and their figureheads. I'm proud to have become a member of the Progressive Secular Alliance and be able to contribute, in my small way, to a cause the ACA seems to have abandoned completely, while watching with equal parts dread and disbelief how they continue to dismantle their organization. Fabian Elfeld, former Facebook and Discord moderator.
The ACA used to be a refuge for all who were negatively affected by religion. The social media areas were filled with people from all walks of life, and the feeling of inclusivity made many feel warm and safe. I was so proud to work for an organization who truly seemed to care about people. All of this is gone now. Marginalized people need to know that the ACA is not safe anymore. The bastion of civility and inclusion has been turned into a hate-filled free-for-all disguised as discourse. Many of us who left were hurt badly by the decisions made by those now in power at the ACA. It was not an easy decision to leave, but I could not be associated with people who would alienate the marginalized in favor of YouTube views, revenue, and fame. Those I considered peers and friends have shown themselves to be the antithesis of what the ACA stood for. The current board of directors are ignoring their own bylaws and turning the ACA into a boys' club of their dreams. If you are hearing my words and are looking for community, do yourself a favor and look past the ACA. Chelsea Rodriguez, former volunteer.
For me, the road to be a member and volunteer of the ACA was a long one. It started at 16 and realizing that what I knew about the various minority communities was wrong and that I was a bigot. Over the coming years, I had to unlearn the preconceptions I had about various groups of people. Eventually, I came across the ACA and realized just how big an issue religious supremacy is, realizing that many of the things I used to believe stemmed from this influence in society. After a short time, I was asked to volunteer on the social media team and eventually being promoted to SMS. For the next couple of months, I worked 20-hour days to get a grip on the ACA Discord server, working to try and create a place that was welcoming to all people with a specific for those in marginalized communities. If it hadn't been for my fellow SMS, I would have burnt out very quickly, as I received zero help from the board or director of communications. Whilst paying an admin for the server, I took action to stop, or try to stop, racists or transphobes from being platformed via Q&As. The racist was accepted as not having a place on our server, but the transphobe was able to continue with theirs. This set the tone for future problems with the ACA as a whole. Moving forward a few months, and RR is platformed after his infamous video. Concerns were raised about this, which were essentially ignored. I was happy to volunteer for the ACA as on paper they promoted the worldview that had taken me nearly 20 years to cultivate on my own. I thought I was with like-minded people who held respect for everyone. It turns out, I was wrong. I had shown that I would stand for the moral and ethical positions that I claimed to have. But they refused to do the same. I felt ashamed that I had promoted the ACA to such great lengths, ashamed that I had been taken in by flowery words without any substance, and ashamed that people could not stand up for the human and civil rights of so many of their members or volunteers. Ian Harrison, former social media specialist.
I line up right next to Chelsea Rodriguez and Janet Reyes above. The bumper sticker version of my position is that the ACA has betrayed the noun in the middle of the name they chose for themselves. They're showing religious types that we can be just as sectarian as they are. They're not behaving like a community, but as an in-group instead. Tom Hubbard, former sponsor.
The ACA was once the gold standard in what an atheist community could be, but it now seems to be just another place for atheists to bash minorities, as long as the bashing is claimed to be rational discourse. Trans athletes are not just some vague idea, they are people, and in case it has escaped anyone's attention, trans people are one of the most vulnerable groups in society. You are not embracing secular humanism if you denigrate trans athletes as some kind of philosophical free speech experiment or use inconclusive science to try and validate cis-only sport categories. You are, in fact, only adding resentment and bigotry towards trans people. The next time a trans person is denied equal rights, abused, fired, beaten, or murdered, ask yourself, did my free speech fuel that hatred. Zak Marsh, former moderator.
I was asked to become a moderator on the ACA Facebook page about a year ago, but I declined. Growing up as an undiagnosed autistic in a violent environment, I've become hypervigilant of people's attitudes and what kind of interactions and rhetoric is acceptable. And I was picking up vibes that there existed troublesome undercurrents in the ACA, which made me reluctant to engage further with it. Delahunty's refusal to own that it was problematic for him to be on the same stage as Sargon of Akkad and the Armored Skeptic was one thing. His limp handling of his debate with JBP was another. The startup of Talk Heathen with two very rough-around-the-edges young men who found it interesting to let rabid transphobes spew their bile on call with them, the way the Atheism Plus talk by some of the women of the ACA was shot down by big white males without any such backing them up in public transmissions, and so on. The ACA spaces and shows stopped being appealing to me for the most part, since there were these constant small jibes, this undercurrent of things I've learned is potentially dangerous to people like me. People who are members of a minority that society at large does not want to see in public. Whether your undesirable trait is ethnicity, gender identity, or having a neurodivergent brain. So I left off and stopped using social media platforms or listening to the ACA-run shows well before the RR debacle. I first noticed that shit was going down when the show where RR sat in with Delahunty came up in my YouTube recommendations, which filled me with a silent nausea since I've heard quite a few of Woodford's transphobic comments before. I remember thinking, damn, is this how far they've actually sunk? So I went to the ACA discussion group and found the howling wilderness it had become after the moderators walked out. I actually wasn't even sure it was the official group. The difference was that stark from what it had been a year past. So I reached out to one of the former moderators who had been very forthcoming and supportive while I was still active in the discussion group, and they brought me up to speed and directed me to where I could find information on what had happened. And it makes me quite sad that things have gotten this bad. The ACA was an enormous resource, and the old show helped me overcome the last of my religious indoctrination way back when. To see the ACA like this brings me pain. Diversity and human rights for all can only exist if it is safeguarded. The ACA has backslid and now champions oppression by laissez-faire. It is such a damn shame it turned out this way. Anonymous number 2, former service user.
I have been disappointed and saddened by the many criticisms leveled against the former hosts and admin and volunteers. People on social media suggesting that they have flounced or that they should stay and fight for what they believe in. I can't really blame folks for these comments because they do not know the whole story. Everyone who left the ACA did so reluctantly, and after trying to fight for those beliefs for a long time. But there comes a point at which you have to accept that you are achieving nothing except your own exhaustion and frustration, and the best option is to walk away. Anonymous number 1, former volunteer.
I watched the Atheist Experience from mid-2013 to late 2018. I appreciated all the hosts for various reasons. I didn't always agree with everything they said, but that's fine, because the disagreements weren't about things that cause harm. Then Matt Delahunty had to be basically dragged kicking and screaming from continuing to share a stage with the likes of Lawrence Krauss after the allegations of sexual misconduct against Krauss came out. That was the point when I stopped taking Delahunty seriously, but I still enjoyed AXP. My time in Atheist Community of Austin moderated spaces on Facebook was basically me trying to educate atheists on where they can do better as a movement and as a community. I made posts about supporting people harmed by religious extremism, Sam Harris's racism and anti-Muslim hate, my experiences navigating the world and atheist spaces as a trans person, and made the suggestion on a couple of occasions that maybe, just maybe, if one is a cis, white, abled atheist who doesn't do anything to fight oppression that religious institutions perpetuate, their atheism is worthless because they're standing by and doing nothing while others are harmed. After the whole Stephen Woodford Rationality Rules thing, I spent my last few days in the ACA Facebook group trying to educate people on the realities of HRT, trans women, and sports. The response was basically a whole lot of racism, misogyny, transmisogyny, and ableism. My last post was a call for atheists to focus on climate change, social justice, and economic justice based on the values of secular humanism, and I was hit with a litany of dictionary trolling and a few people defending Sam Harris's platforming of Charles Murray and race realism itself. It is now a cesspool of alt-right BS as far as I'm concerned. In short, movement atheism has become a dumpster fire of racism, sexism, anti-trans hate, and ableism, where emotional and cognitive disabilities are concerned. And I want no part of it, because it is in complete conflict with my values as a secular humanist. Comrade Nautica, out.
Drew McCoy claimed that he had paid somebody in the control room $30 at some point for a membership, though there was no record of a PayPal payment or a credit card swipe. It would have had to have been in cash, and he would have also had to have filled out a membership form for it to have been a valid membership, and then that form disappeared without a trace. I would know, because all memberships went through me. Jamie vouched for him and claimed to remember discussing the membership requirement for being a show host with Drew. But wait, was Drew even a regular host of an ACA show? In any case, I went through every bit of paper and financial record I had, and could find no evidence of this membership ever happening. With the person barred from running the previous year due to only having 4 months of membership, we had all the paperwork. John Iacoletti, former treasurer and membership chair.
I didn't know who Woodford was or anything about what happened until 2 ACA officers alerted me there might be controversy during Atheist Experience calls. I was hosting the following day. I watched Woodford's video. It was a call for segregation based on an argument that innate physically derived athletic advantage is non-problematic for cis athletes, but ban-worthy for trans athletes. If it's a problem for either, then it was confusingly framed as a trans issue. It put forward that one demographic of athletes should be banned for something that is routinely and historically accepted when it manifests between athletes outside that demographic. ACA's board had issued a statement distancing itself from the damaging content and apologizing for putting the secular trans community at risk by negligently featuring the video's creator as a guest, without addressing his prejudiced ideology. The ACA president later retracted the statement while a correction video was under consideration. I suggested it feature a trans activist to walk through the original video point by point. With ACA's approval, I contacted an activist in a good faith attempt to assist ACA, Woodford, and the trans community. I stressed the correction must demonstrate a clear understanding of the original problems for it to be meaningful and acceptable. After meeting with the activist, Woodford handled the correction himself. After it released, I observed updates to irrelevant facts with the original anti-trans theme still intact. Those in the atheist community who supported Woodford by saying a correction was forthcoming have been silent, or worse, now argue that simply reissuing the original anti-trans content under the label correction is a demonstration of a lesson learned. Meanwhile, ACA's social media spaces began pervasively echoing the same anti-trans calls for segregation and misgendering. I walked into the May election unaware. Many newer people involved with the ACA shows were present. One established member who supported their bid for change had already expressed privately to me that the social media spaces shouldn't be moderated, even if anti-trans bigotry were rampant. Publicly, the original board statement figured prominently. Backlash included most of the production volunteers demanding full control of hosts, guests, and content, while the member-elected ACA board representatives should remain uninvolved. These volunteers and their supporting members expressed significant hostility towards the then-current board for the board's attempt to mitigate the unsafe situation the production side had created and maintains for transgender people. In 5 hours of discussion, I don't recall any of them expressing concern for or understanding their role in putting the lives of secular trans people in danger. They expressed much concern, however, that people perpetuating this bigotry felt offended. Marginalization erodes the mental health of individuals within targeted populations via a cumulative effect of microaggressions, like misgendering. Marginalized groups are at a greater risk of social violence, losing basic rights, and self-harm. If I call out violence and self-harm faced by gay youth from social and religious bigotry, I must also call out violence and self-harm faced by trans youth due to social and religious bigotry. Attempted suicide rates amongst trans youth are an astounding 40 to 50%. This is on top of overt social violence and relentless efforts to strip their basic rights and identities. Recently in Dallas, multiple trans women were murdered. One woman was beaten into a coma in broad daylight by a group of men while bystanders shouted homophobic slurs, misgendering her as a gay man. I can't condemn churches for harming marginalized people while defending secular people for doing the same. I have read many comments from ACA show fans and members expressing that I and others left ACA over a trivial matter. I left to find people who share my values, who don't consider the lives and deaths of marginalized people as trivial, especially when compared to the hurt feelings and reputations of prominent atheist personalities or entities who put them in harm's way. Tracie Harris, former host and director.
The ACA changed for the worse on March 29th, with Woodford's publishing on YouTube a transphobic video on trans women in sports. I'm not going to go into detail on how it was wrong in almost every claim or why it was wrong. Others have done that very well. But I am going to state categorically that Woodford is transphobic. Period. Women's sports don't need people pretending to white knight for them just to bash a marginalized community. So Woodford published his video. Then, to add insult to injury, he appeared on an ACA production on April 28th. After he'd made his transphobic video. Not one mention was made of his previous video. The ACA, sensing finally the need to respond to the kerfluffle over Woodford's bigotry, announced that they supported trans people. They criticized Woodford for his video. Woodford himself responded and said that he'd take comments and criticism and that he would publish an apology video. That never happened. And the ACA not only backed down from the original statement of criticism against Woodford's video, but it apologized to him for vilifying his character. They apologized to a transphobic YouTube content creator for criticizing him for making a transphobic video, and Woodford appeared on more ACA productions. Then a cascade of events started. One of the YouTube mods resigned, in protest, a brief time thereafter, at the end of April. There was a conversation later with the admins that directed the social media platforms for the ACA, and subsequently, they all resigned in protest on the same day, May 7th. Over the next few weeks, as the ACA hemorrhaged more and more volunteers, including not just the social media moderators, but hosts for the shows as well, various officers in the ACA tried various forms of damage control. Oh, it's not that bad, they'd opine, as they slowly lost host after host, mod after mod, their social media blowing up with more and more extreme examples of bigotry against a marginalized community. Remember, right in the ACA statement at the time, it supposedly supported the same community and said that it would not allow such derisiveness, such unwarranted criticism, such bigotry to take place. And now we're here. The ACA has given up moderation, it has broken its own bylaws, it has engendered investigations into its 501c3 status, it has thrown away any claim to actual support it might once have given to the community it promised to give a home to. And now we're here. Why? Because a transphobic YouTuber posted a video and some of the ACA's hosts at the time supported him. They pretended not to do so, of course, to the public at large for a brief period of time. But they did. How do I know all this? How can I back up my claims? I have receipts. I have screenshots of conversations I've had with various officers in the ACA during the time frame. I worked for the ACA, both prior to and during that time frame, as an author for their newsletter and in the organization itself. I first heard of the ACA through a friend. It was an oasis of a community for me at the time. Since most of the atheistic-leaning groups I'd found tended to give marginalized members short shrift. For a while, it became a second home for me. I grew to know most of the board, the hosts for various shows, the people working behind the scenes to pull it all off. I became a moderator for the Facebook page and eventually the SMS or social media specialist or administrator for their YouTube channels. It all seemed to go very well, and the ACA and I seemed to have a long road ahead, working together for admirable goals. That is no longer possible. The ACA has become a home for transphobic bigots and for racists as well. I have receipts for those claims too. A once proud, once supportive organization has turned on a marginalized community, including multiple members of its own staff. And now finally we're here. This isn't a gleeful response. This isn't a diatribe against what the ACA once stood for or what it could have been. This is heartfelt sadness at a once great organization that has fallen through both inactivity and activity on the part of some of its upper echelon, to a depth from which it probably will never recover. It's a sadness coming from me, reflecting upon what could have been. I could have ignored it, I could have soldiered on, I could have tried like others did, and I give them full credit for doing so, to stop the hemorrhaging, to stop the influx of bigotry, to stop the destruction of an organization that at one point was loved by so many. It could have been like a fairy tale, but fairy tales aren't real. Things don't work like that. There's a price for everything. Maureen Johnson. It's a price that, as a trans woman, I am unwilling to pay. Erin Greene, former YouTube social media specialist, admin,